Go from the Metro Toronto Chinese and Southeast Asian Legal Clinic, Color of Poverty, Color of Change.
I was born and grew up in Hong Kong. And if you know anything about the Hong Kong situation, for die-hard capitalists, Hong Kong is heaven on earth. We have a tax system whereby we don't have income tax, we have salaries tax, which means that non-employment source income, such as capital gains, are not subject to any tax. And there's a maximum of 17% on the marginal tax rate. So if you make $90,000 Hong Kong or above, you're subject to the 17% tax rate. And I remember when I was little, start watching TV and so on. From time to time, you will hear reports about fire in the hill, and then there'll be like hundreds of thousands of homes being destroyed in a fire. And people lost their homes and become homeless. And why? Because the poor people in Hong Kong at that time lived in huts that were built along the hills. And Hong Kong is a very hilly city. And so every time there's a fire, it wiped out hundreds of homes, so-called homes. And in the 70s, the Hong Kong government decided to introduce massive housing reform. And what they did was put in like millions upon millions of dollars to build affordable housing, rental units, as well as home ownership program. And what it did is that it allowed people who are, who used to live in a hut to move into apartment units, basically. Of course, they're not great. But they are also home ownership program for people who are either in subsidized units or low-income, working poor, whose income does not exceed a certain level. They can also move into these units, basically buy the unit from the government at a very low price. And that basically wiped out all the shanty towns kind of in Hong Kong. And I often, of course, like poverty is a huge issue in Hong Kong, it still is, there are a lot of problems, but I often think if a place like Hong Kong can resolve a housing issue during my lifetime, and in fact before I even grew up, why is it that a country like Canada cannot do it? And I just, it's just beyond me. So, and at the risk of stating the obvious, and I think that some of the stories that we heard today from Scott and others really speak to that vision. The ultimate goal of building housing, affordable housing, is not just about building houses with roof above our head. It is about building an equitable and inclusive society, inclusive neighborhood, city, country, where segregation no longer exists, where people can share the resources and space in an equitable and respectful way. And that's really what we want to do. We want to achieve at the end of the day. And really it's that vision that we hear from the other speakers that we talked about today. And it's a vision that the Color Poverty Campaign has in mind when we started our campaign. And the very reason why we came together was, in fact, the realization that poverty in Canada has become racialized, and it has been that way for a number of years. So some of the statistics show, for instance, between 1980 and 2000, poverty rate among non-racialized groups in Toronto has dropped by 28%. But during the same time period, poverty rate for racialized groups increased by 361%. And with the increasing racialization of poverty, members of racialized communities are also more likely to become homeless or in underhousing kind of situation and have greater difficulties in accessing affordable housing. And some of the statistics that I've looked at recently, for instance, the largest proportion of native-born Canadians in core housing needs are Black, while the largest proportion of immigrant residents in core housing needs are those of Arab or West Asian background. There are more visible minorities, 16.8%, than non-visible minority, 12.3%, native-born Canadians in core housing needs. In Toronto, in 2001, over 43% of recent immigrants, many of whom are racialized, had core housing needs. And in addition, poor and racialized neighborhoods are often stereotyped as bad areas. People who are racialized are more criminalized, and they are also more at risk of being evicted by social housing authorities, including the family members who are with them as well. So all of these studies, actually, studies and stats confirm my own experiences working in a legal clinic, where 100% of our clients are racialized, vast majority immigrants from the Chinese and Southeast Asian communities in the Greater Toronto area. And most of my clients are in private housing situation where they are not even covered by the Residential Tenancy Act because of the accommodation are shared with the landlord. So they don't get any protection under the law. Many are poor, but not poor enough to get social assistance. They don't get priority housing. They are not necessarily on the waiting list, which is too long anyway. Many of them are non-status, so they don't even qualify for social housing. And then, of course, on top of all that, there's the issue of discrimination, which some of the earlier speakers talked about. Sometimes it's on the basis, most of the time it's on the basis of race, sometimes it's on the basis of gender or family status. Pregnant women in particular are often being discriminated in accessing housing, or single moms, as it was mentioned. But in my particular case, many of our clients, because of the language barriers, they're new to the country, and all these other issues, they do not even file human rights complaints, let alone having the time to deal with this. And I know that the CERA report that was mentioned earlier talks about some of the issues facing racialized groups, and particularly Black and South Asian. And I can assure you that's the same issue for the Chinese as well. But I think for a lot of reasons, particularly language issues, a lot of the issues are very hidden. So racism is a big issue, not just in housing, but in society in general. Of course, we know that. So at the Color Poverty Campaign, we believe that any affordable housing strategy must adopt an inclusive approach that looks at and incorporates anti-racism, anti-oppression principles, and that we believe the right to housing must be enshrined in our law. And we need a comprehensive housing strategy, and many people have talked about the various components. We will add to those lists two particular ideas. One is that there should be targeted funding for housing for racialized groups, and secondly, priorities for social housing for racialized communities in areas where they are disproportionately overrepresented among the low-income groups. But we also believe that all forms of housing, whether it's permanent, shelter, transitional, whether it's for seniors, for youth, and so on, they need to reflect and appropriately respond to the needs and realities of the diverse population in our country. And on top of all that, when we talk about housing, we need to look at inclusive zoning as a neighborhood diversifying and integrating tool to deal with the growing racialized as well as spatialized social economic clustering, as talked about by people like David Kuczynski in his 3 cities and other similar research. Because if we only deal with the housing without looking at neighborhoods, we may end up with a lot of social housings, but they all cluster in one area. Those are the poor neighborhoods that nobody else wants to go to. We have to make sure we have to break down those barriers to make all of our society equitable and inclusive for everyone. And I would say that these are not pipe dreams that are out of reach. If Hong Kong can do it, we can certainly do it. There's no reason why we cannot have a system that look at local housing need on ethno-racial as well as other desegregated ground to make sure that those who are most in need will get their access first. And I would also finally argue that it is particularly timely to start implementing these goals now in an economic recession. Money is an issue, but you know what? If we have a recession, investing in our communities, building houses for everyone is one of the most effective ways to get ourselves out of this recession. And while we're at it, we need to make sure that there are employment equity provisions and conditions attached to all these investments, whether it's just renovating existing units or new investments to build new housing, so that all of us will have a chance to work to build to work together to build this affordable housing for everyone. Thank you.